Unfortunately, Congress has not fulfilled its responsibility. It's failed to pass a budget, and as a result, much of our government must now shut down until Congress funds it again.
Grinding to a halt. But what's behind the political standoff in the United States? And who will be affected? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. Government departments in the United States are shutting down after the two houses of Congress failed to agree on a budget. Only workers deemed to be essential will be at their desks. Hundreds of thousands of others are being told to stay at home without pay. Politicians are divided over President Obama's health care reforms. The Republican-led House of Representatives wants the new law delayed or dismantled, and they've made it a condition of passing the new budget. Obama's allies in the Democratic-led Senate have repeatedly countered their endeavors. So as the clock ticked towards the midnight hour and the end of the fiscal year, with the money effectively running out, the government staggered into a partial shutdown.
So the bill before us is very simple. It funds the government, and it says let's treat our constituents fairly. No more mandate for the next year that you have to buy insurance that you can't afford. No more mandate that members of Congress get some so-called exemption. Those are the only two issues here. All the Senate has to do is say yes, and the government's funded tomorrow.
The House once again has attached ridiculous policy writers that are dead on arrival over here. Republicans will once again threaten to shut down the government unless Democrats repeal Obamacare for a year. But once again, we will not relitigate the health care debate or negotiate at the point of a gun.
So what's the fallout from all of this, and who's affected? It is the 17th time there's been a partial shutdown of the government. The last time was in 1995 under President Bill Clinton. More than 800,000 federal employees are facing unpaid leave this time around, with no guarantee of back pay. That's about a third of the workforce. National parks and museums will be closed, and agencies like NASA and the Environmental Agency will be all but shuttered. Those classified as essential government employees, such as air traffic controllers and border patrol agents, will continue working, along with staff tied to national security and nuclear power and weapons. And all military personnel on active duty will remain at their posts. Let's bring in our guests now in Washington, D.C. Republican strategist and advisor Soren Dayton. Joining us here in Doha is Gary Wasserman, a professor of American government at Georgetown University here. And in Atlanta, we have Jason Johnson, a professor of political science at Huron College in Ohio, who has worked as campaign manager for both the Republicans and Democrats in House and Senate races. Gentlemen, a very big and warm welcome. Soren Dayton, let me start off with you. What happened? Talk us through how it played out from a Republican perspective.
Well, over the last 24 hours, the House, and actually over the weekend, over the last 72 hours, the House passed a series of what are called continuing resolutions. These are resolutions. They don't have to be signed by the president, but they have to be agreed to by the Senate, that would fund the government with a variety of policy prescriptions attached to them. These included, at the beginning, complete repeal of Obamacare in the first round, and then they gradually backed down to two items. That was the one we heard from Speaker Boehner just at the beginning of the segment, which was a delay, a 1-year delay of the implementation of what's called the individual mandate, which requires that people purchase health care or they get penalized on their taxes for it and a repeal of a medical device tax, which is having a pretty substantial negative impact on the industry of medical device manufacturers and making medical devices, certain medical devices, not really usable for medical purposes.
Okay.
And the Senate, in every case, rejected all of those and then sent the bill back to the House. They did this by stripping those policy amendments and sending it back to the House. And then the last thing the House did is it called for, it passed a motion to go to conference, which means the House and the Senate would agree to sit down and produce a proposal. This morning, the Senate refused, the Senate, again on a party line vote, rejected the motion to go to conference, and now we're just waiting. The Senate's position is the House has some bills in front of it. The House's position is the Senate has some bills in front of it, and at some point somebody's going to blink. We just don't know when, and we don't know how.
Okay, when you got this result, when the Republicans got their way, were they high-fiving and whooping?
There is a range of opinions in the House Republican caucus and a range of opinions in the Senate Republican caucus. There's a group in the Senate led by Ted Cruz that thinks this is a good idea. There's I would say probably the majority of both the Senate and House Republicans think this is a bad result, but there are, it takes 218 votes to pass something, and at the moment there aren't. There's probably 20 to 30 holdouts among the House Republicans that would not vote for anything.
Okay, let me bring in Jason Johnson. He's been
like
shaking his head while you were talking. Why is that, Jason?
Because this is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. This is purely the fault of the Republican Party in the House. It's not just a matter of they added a few amendments here and a few amendments there. What essentially they have handed the Senate and the president is a hostage letter. I mean, it could have been written in broken script. And what they've been saying basically is that in order to fund the government, we want you to implement Mitt Romney's platform from last year. This is a failure of leadership on the part of John Boehner. This is an absolute, almost treasonous level of irresponsibility and a violation of the pledge that people take when they're elected to office, and they should be ashamed. And I think one of the biggest problems that we've been having in our narratives and our discussions of this is to pretend that this is gridlock. This is not gridlock. This is not a lack of bipartisanship. This is borderline anarchy on the part of the Republicans in the House, and it's causing the United States and the rest of the world to suffer economically.
Gary, I should imagine to this story there are three sides. What's your view and the fact that time and time again both sides were not able to compromise?
Well, I half agree with Jason. I mean, I think the storyline has been that Washington's polarized and therefore it's paralyzed. In fact, he's right. The paralysis lies within the Republican Party, and it lies with people elected from single-party districts who essentially are speaking to those districts in the House and trying to get reelected with a party support. Unfortunately, it seems to me what it does to the Republicans is it deprives them of a chance to form a national coalition. So the real problem is the moderate candidates they've selected as presidential candidates in the past, Romney, McCain, can't run on this kind of platform. And essentially the congressional party is making it very, very difficult for a national party to resurrect itself out of these ashes.
Soren, it seems that the Pyrrhic victory there, if you could call it that, is not going to benefit the Republicans too much, certainly from an image point of view amongst the Americans and within the Republican Party.
Well, as I said, I think both the House and the Senate Republican leadership don't want this result. This is, as I said, it's 20-30 House Republicans that are bringing this about. I would point out, though, that we have not passed a budget in the United States since 2009, and in many ways, President Obama and Senate Democrats have totally abdicated any financial responsibility or any fiscal responsibility. The Senate hasn't, until this year, had not even voted on a budget on the floor of the Senate since 2009, and the White House has systematically dialed back any plans they've had for any long-term fiscal planning. So it is gridlock in the sense that this is the end of a pattern that has been emerging since 2010, when there was a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House, a Democratic president, and these guys still couldn't put a budget on the floor because they were so afraid of admitting the fiscal consequences of their policy. So, the idea that this is just a Republican problem is delusional. And furthermore, I would point out that the Senate today wouldn't even go to conference. The Senate rejected on a party line vote a motion to go to conference to discuss plans, and President Obama hasn't sat down to discuss fiscal issues with John Boehner since last year. So we're in a situation where there is, in fact, complete dysfunction. It is on both sides. The Republican caucus has created some additional problems, but I think it's worth underlining just how dysfunctional the Democrats were when they were in charge, and just how little people on either side are talking to each other.
Dysfunction. I'm going to put this to you, Jason. You've been shaking your head there as well, disagreeing with almost everything that's been said. But I mean, there clearly is a big problem here. I mean, both sides have taken the country to some sort of economic cliff because they can't agree. I mean, this is clearly a lot more than political theatre going on.
Well, no. This really does go down to political theater. You have, whether you want to use Soren's 30 holdouts or holdouts or whatever, you have members of the Republican caucus who do not believe that Barack Obama is a legitimate president. That's what this boils down to. They don't just disagree with him. They don't think he's a citizen. They don't think he's legitimate. They think he's some sort of, Manchurian candidate terrorist. And they've had that attitude since they took over the House in 2010. And the problem is, when you do not think someone is legitimately in office, you have absolutely no incentive to ever negotiate. This is not a matter of one side gives a little bit and the other side gives a little bit. Look, there are plenty of problems with the Affordable Care Act. There are Democrats who don't like it. There's Republicans who don't like it. But never before in our history has the way to push through policy been to consistently put the entire country at risk, whether to default on loans, whether to shut down the entire government. That is the problem here, that the Republicans, because they can't win in elections, because they can't get the majority of the public to agree with them, they decide that they want to take everybody off the cliff with them. That's dysfunction. That's the Republican side, not the Democrats.
And Gary, what a pity that it's happening now. I mean, the U.S., from an economic point of view, was looking pretty confident.
Well, one of the problems, if I'm a Republican, I want to be running against Obama. I want to make Obama the issue. Instead, I've made myself the issue. I've made my unwillingness to kind of accept a law that's been passed, approved by the Supreme Court, and going into effect. I've made that the issue. There's plenty of things to run against Obama on, one of which is not, incidentally, that he is some unreasoning, uncompromising dictator. That completely goes against everything people have learned about Obama, which is he seldom sticks to a position. He's all too willing to compromise, and he's bent over backwards to try to reach agreement. All of a sudden now he becomes the emperor in the White House, which I don't think is a credible argument, incidentally.
Okay, let's talk about what's central to all of what's going on at the moment. President Obama's Affordable Health Care Act, which is a centerpiece of his second-term agenda. So what has it involved? At the moment, some 47 million Americans don't have any healthcare insurance. Under the new law, all Americans are guaranteed access to healthcare coverage, regardless of how old they are or whether they have pre-existing medical conditions. Lower-income families will be offered subsidies to help with this. Americans will be able to buy insurance from online exchanges where they can compare the different options available and see if they qualify for financial help. Some parts of the new law came into effect on Tuesday. Come next year, those without medical insurance will face a fine. And of course, Jason, the irony of this is that shutting down the government won't stop what's known as Obamacare. It's going ahead right now. People are signing up.
Exactly. That's what makes this so ridiculous. And I think from a strategic standpoint, what I would say to the Republicans is, if you are so convinced that the Affordable Care Act is a horrible boondoggle that will destroy this country, then let it happen. Because by next summer, if Americans really don't like it, it'll be the perfect place for Republicans to run for re-election and to take over the Senate in next fall's midterms. But they have this sort of frustration with it that they don't even want it to happen under any circumstances. And I think the core of that is I think they're afraid that people might like it. And if it turns out that the American citizens actually like the Affordable Care Act, even with all the problems it has, then the Republicans have even less ideological ground to stand on. I think that's where a lot of this frustration on their part is coming
Is that
from.
the fear here, that Americans might actually like this? Because if you think about it, I mean, universal health care for all can't be a bad thing, can it?
Well, first of all, it's not all. Over 10 million aren't going to be covered by this. Second of all, my friend hasn't considered what the actual amendments that the House passed and the Senate rejected were. The House passed an amendment that would not require people to get it, not require people to buy it. If that were the case and people want to buy it, they'd buy it. So this is a perfect example of where Senate stubbornness and Democratic stubbornness is getting in the way. This is not a central provision of actually giving people health care. If it were such a good thing, they'd buy it. That said, I think what the House has been trapped into by 30 members is ridiculous. I actually agree that the right thing for Republicans to do would be to let the bad policy take place and run against it.
Yeah, not link the two.
This is,
I mean, Gary,
why
do you think? Sorry, excuse me, jumping in there. Sorry, Gary, why do you think this Healthcare Act is so repugnant in so many quarters of the country?
Well, I don't think it is. I think Bill Clinton had a point that the real Republican fear is that it'll work, not that it won't work. But I think it also is a kind of hostage, if you like, excuse the expression, to internal Republican politics. People do not want to see the government go ahead with business as usual from the conservative wing of the Republican Party. They don't want their elected representatives to go along with Washington. They want them to make a stand. What's interesting about this is that some of the Republicans who seem to be lining up to run as president in 2016 are lining up on the conservative side of things. So a guy like Ted Cruz now must have been reading the tea leaves and thinks he's going to come at the nomination from the right end of the Republican Party. This is a change in the Republican Party. This is a drastic change, and I think it's a losing strategy.
Okay. Now, I'm afraid to say that things could possibly get worse if this isn't bad enough as it is. There's another issue looming on the horizon. The government risks running out of money to pay its bills later this month unless Congress raises the federal borrowing cap. This is a legal limit on how much debt the government can pile up. If Congress cannot agree on raising the cap, some estimates suggest the government will have to cut spending by up to 32%. It could also miss interest payments on U.S. treasuries. These are bonds held by banks, governments, and individuals worldwide. Failing to pay up could result in a first-ever default by U.S. government. Gary, is there a danger that the two crises facing Barack Obama, the budget standoff and the looming deadline on borrowing, may collide?
You know, I'll defer to the stock market. It seems to have decided that this is not going to happen, that this is a kind of, we're kind of getting scared by shadows at this point, and that when push comes to shove, it's kind of nice theater, you can compete in a lot of different levels, but you're not going to let the real disaster occur. And I've been wrong about the stock market a number of times. This may be another time, but I think I will defer to the wisdom of the marketplace and say this will not happen.
Okay, what role, Soren, do you think Republicans will have in this? I believe that some concessions could be linked to this as well.
Well, and that's right. And we don't know what that negotiation is going to look like. Last time, the president agreed to some spending cuts, and those ended up taking effect. And frankly, the deficit has fallen substantially. So the American fiscal situation is in a much better spot because of what I'm sure my friend here will say was hostage taking. So there is a very positive. There are positive options. There are negative options. I'm with Gary. I don't think in the end this will have a huge impact on the stock market. The stock market is not worried about it too much because there are so many vehicles for pushing back dates. And in the end, frankly, and this will make Republicans angry, but I suspect it may end up being one of the things that happen. The U.S. government will just continue printing money because there is a constitutional obligation not to default. And
Jason, I
so
feel that you've got something
see.
to say on this. Do you think the U.S. could default, and if it does?
What I think is I don't necessarily think that we're going to have a default. I think that everyone on every single side recognizes that that would be fundamentally insane and put this country at risk in ways that no one can truly anticipate. But what I think is going to happen and how it's connected to this current shutdown is I think this shutdown is going to last a while. Because I think what's going to end up happening is the Democrats, the Republicans, and very likely the president are going to sit down in a room and say, look, we are going to have to hammer out everything right now. I'm sure the President of the United States is thinking, I've had to spend the first 9 months of my second term battling battles from the first term. And I think that what we're going to see when we finally get a new continuing resolution, when we finally get the government funded again, is they're going to try and wrap the debt ceiling up in this same argument. I don't think anybody on either side wants to do this fight every 6 weeks, every 3 months, all the way until the 2014 midterms. It wouldn't make any sense. So I think we have a longer shutdown, and I think the debt ceiling gets wrapped into these final negotiations.
Gary, it really makes you wonder who's benefiting from this, because the reality is that right now you have some 800,000 Americans who are sitting at home, they don't know how long for, and not getting paid.
Listen, I think it was Clausewitz who says never interfere with the enemy when he's destroying yourself. I think the problem the Democrats have now in compromising is they're enjoying the show. I mean, let the Republicans argue with each other. Let them battle over this. The Republicans are going to take the loss on this. Sooner or later, they're going to have to get down from this position they're in. And it seems to me, I have a difficult time advising or seeing the Democrats making that very easy on them. They're going to let it go on longer. Why not? And only some concern for, quote, good government or the welfare of the nation or some general public concerns are going to get the Democrats to kind of interfere with this kind of internecine warfare that the Republicans are having.
Soren, are you worried about what sort of impact this is having on the reputation of the U.S. within the country and internationally?
Absolutely. This is not responsible governance. When the credit agencies downgraded the U.S. debt, they didn't do it because there was a risk of default. They did it because people in Washington were being unserious in how they were governing, and that's both the White House, that's the House Republicans, it's the Senate Democrats. There are unserious people who are leading this discussion, and I would put 30 members of the House, I'd put Senator Reid, and I'd put Barack Obama right at the top of the list of those unserious, irresponsible people.
I should imagine the Americans are feeling pretty rattled right now, Jason. Something's got to give. What's it going to be?
I think eventually the Republicans in the House will capitulate. They don't really have any room to operate from this point. And I also think what's going to end up happening is when people start going home to their districts, for these first couple of days, you're probably going to have some far right people say, look, the government shut down. It doesn't really make a difference. We need to do more cuts. But by next week, when bills start to become due, and I think what's important for everyone to understand is the ripple effect. This isn't just the government employees who are going home. This means cab drivers. This means little bars that serve lunch to federal employees. This means child care providers who aren't going to make money because people are staying home and taking care of their own kids. This is dry cleaners. The ripple effect on the economy is going to be terrible. And I think these Republicans are going to come back from their districts and say, look, we can't do this any longer. And that's what's going to end up happening. The economic impact could last us all the way until Christmas. Nobody wants to see that.
Gary, you were trying to get in there?
Well, I was just thinking, somebody compared Washington to the last 5 minutes of the Roman Empire. I mean, I'm afraid the expectation of good behavior in Washington has long since left most close observers of American politics. It's always been messy. It's always been a bit of a circus. And I'm afraid this does nothing to enhance its reputation, but I'm afraid also it doesn't lower it very much.
Well, Soren, I mean, the politics at the moment, particularly messy.
Yes, they are. It's a really scary time how little serious attempts there are to resolve some of these conflicts on either side. I mean, as I said, President Obama has not sat down with with Speaker Boehner, the leader of the House Republicans, to address any of these issues in 9 months. I mean, he took a question. Yes, or the president's press secretary took a question. Why are you? You spoke to the president of Iran yesterday or a couple of days ago, but you haven't, which took 30 years, but you haven't spoken to the number 3 leader of the U.S. government. What's going on? So,
Well, there's
you know,
rather
this is where we are.
extraordinary scenario there in the United States. Thank you very much, all three of you, for helping us understand it a little better. Soren Dayton, Gary Wasserman, and Jason Johnson. And don't forget, you can find this program at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story, and why not tweet us your comments? You can find us at AJ Inside Story. I'm Jane Dutton. Thanks very much for watching.